Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Overnight into Wednesday, Israeli and U.S. forces launched another wave of strikes on Iran and Lebanon. In response, Iran targeted several Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. 5 days into coordinated strikes by the U.S. and Israel on Iran, targets have expanded from missile factories to leadership compounds. Now, President Donald Trump has said that combat operations will continue until all objectives are achieved. And joining us now to discuss the latest is Dr. Matthew Powell, lecturer in Air Power Studies, University of Portsmouth. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we also are hearing the latest now. I mean, these objectives that Donald Trump has spoken of, the President of the United States. In your mind, what we've seen already in these last few days, also there's a letter apparently that he wrote to Congress just in the last sort of few hours saying here, I'm quoting here, that it is not yet possible to know the full scope and duration of the strikes. What do you think the objectives are?
Well, the noises coming out of the White House administration appear to be a little bit confused and a little bit contradictory in terms of what they're saying. We've who has already said that the goal was for regime change, but we've also had the Secretary of State for War, Pete Hegseth, say about reducing the capability of Iran to build nuclear weapons. And then we've had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's contradicted that and said that it's designed as a preemptive strike to protect the US and Israel from conventional strikes from Iran. So there does appear to be a degree of confusion and contradiction over what the actual political objectives are that the US is seeking to achieve in conjunction with Israel with these attacks.
All right, so let's talk about also not just the political, but the technical and the military. That's your area of expertise. Looking at the kind of strikes we've been seeing, I mean, this has been very heavy bombardment, apparently thousands of targets over these last few days. How do you sense this? Is this going to lead to, well, in your mind, what does success look like from these airstrikes? How long can this kind of air superiority be sustained? What are the impacts of all this?
Well, in terms of the air superiority, the attacks that have been conducted previously against Iran by Israel and by the US have severely degraded the Iranians' air defense systems, which means that US and Israeli air assets have pretty much got freedom of the skies to attack whichever targets they want. In terms of the types of targets that we're being that are seen targeted, what we're looking at, I think, is a decapitation strategy, an attempt to try and remove the senior leadership of the regime. We've seen that the supreme leader was killed over the weekend. The interim supreme leader was killed within hours of being appointed after that. So we're looking at the idea of trying to remove the head of the snake and to create the potential for an uprising of the Iranian people in order to try and replace the current regime with something that will put that in Washington and Israeli eyes, it will be much more Western friendly, much more Israeli friendly. But there are challenges with that. And it comes back to the previous question where you asked about the political objectives. These political objectives are needed and have to be clear cut and have to be achievable in order to set the strategy for what you want to achieve in war. You cannot diverge the two components of war. War is an inherently political activity, and you need an achievable political goal to be able to set a strategy to be able to achieve it.
And also in terms of, we've talked about, you mentioned here a decapitation event. I mean, looking at going after leadership, we know that Khamenei, for instance, has been struck, where there are reports that apparently there's already a new supreme leader to be announced. We're not sure if that's 100% true. But nevertheless, looking at it from also a historical perspective, I mean, if we're looking at maybe Gaddafi in Libya, if we're looking at Hussein in Iraq, or historically even Afghanistan, can a continued and sustained air power strike, can that kind of campaign actually become regime change, if you will, or how much is that enough? Will it continue? Does it have to have other operations?
Well, the challenge with attempting a decapitation strategy using air power alone is that you're unable to control events on the ground. And what we see in Libya, what we saw in Libya in 2011 was that US and French and British air power were able to set the conditions for an uprising but that there wasn't any capability or ability to help control events to make sure that the situation didn't descend into civil war and into chaos. And that's what we saw in Iraq in 2003. We saw a successful decapitation strategy where the Saddam Hussein regime was toppled in a matter of weeks after operations began in 2003. But the coalition forces were unable to control the situation on the ground. And we saw insurgency, we saw civil war start to emerge. And that was in a nation that is a lot smaller in terms of landmass and population than we see with Iran. And so the ability of Western nations to be able to control the narrative, control the events that occur on the ground, is going to be much more complicated if the Iranian people are left to themselves. One of the stranger things that Donald Trump has said is that he wants the Iranian security forces, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and the police service, those who create the security conditions within Iran, to surrender their weapons. But it raises the question as to who are they to surrender their weapons to if there aren't forces on the ground to accept that surrender? The other challenge that emerges in Iran is that there is no government in waiting. There is no opposition that is unified within Iran that can step into the power vacuum that will be created by the fall of the current regime in Tehran. And so this has the potential, as in Libya, to just descend into chaos and civil war. And what we see now since 2011 in Libya is that it is essentially a failed state with no effective governance and competing governments, a civil war, insurgency, and that this could have huge consequences for the region in terms of destabilizing the entire region. This could easily spread to neighboring countries where the neighbors of Iran seek to gain advantage by trying to place politicians and leaders that are friendly to them into power. And so this has the potential to expand and to really exacerbate the situation.
Mm-hmm. And I want to come back to what the administration is saying in Washington, because we've heard a different narrative come from different parts of high-level officials. If we're looking at also what Vice President Vance said, that it's not really about regime change anymore. We have Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, saying very much it's about denying the ballistic missile risk. It's Donald Trump saying it's about not having a nuclear-armed Iran. How much of the narrative here impacts what's next, and how sustainable is this kind of air campaign? And we have a lot of logistics in the Gulf already, but I mean, how long can this be drawn out with such conflicting military objectives?
Well, with such conflicting military objectives, the problem becomes, what is your end goal, and how do you measure success, and then how do you set conditions for peace to emerge after the fighting has stopped? And with these conflicting messages, does the US do Israel stop when they believe that Iranian ballistic missile capabilities have been degraded to a sufficient degree? Is it when the US believe that the capabilities of Iran to develop a nuclear weapon have been degraded? And so these are two entirely different goals that require entirely different strategies. And so there will be confusion amongst the military and the planners within the military as to what objectives are they seeking, how are they measuring success. And so this could lead to a continuation of a campaign, or this could lead to its short-term curtailment within the next 24 to 40 hours. We can't be sure what with the unclear objectives when this will end. What we're seeing in terms of how long this might go on for, the US and Israel will have the capability and the weapon stockpiles to carry this on for at least another 1 to 2 weeks without overly concerning the downgrading of their weapon supplies. But it raises a really interesting question with the response of Iran as to how far the US and Israel are going to be willing to utilize fast jet air assets like F-35, like the F-16, to meet incoming drone attacks that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And so you've got operations in air defense that are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars at the time to run, to defeat missiles and weapon systems that are a fraction of the cost. And that is one of the things that's going to have to be considered by Western militaries more generally in future warfare, is to what extent they are willing to utilize a very expensive, hard to replace assets to defeat very cheap, commercially available, or if not commercially available, then easily manufactured, cheaper alternatives to conduct attacks with.
And just really one quick final point, just a sentence on, we've seen obviously a lot of strikes in the region as well, in the Gulf, different Gulf states. Do you see this as, let's say, escalating further? Will we see more friendly fire? Will we see more collateral damage? Just a quick sense before we end.
Undoubtedly, we'll see more friendly fire. The fog of war will create that. And what Tehran will look to do is to bring regional actors into this war to try and expand it as far as possible and make the costs of victory for the US, for Israel, and for their allied partners in the region as expensive as possible to try and get them to reduce and roll back on the attacks and eventually stop them.
All right, so thanks for all of that insight there this morning. Dr. Matthew Powell there from the University of Portsmouth. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.